Welcome to another episode of 4 Random Books. I think I'm recording rather too many of these in one go, but I think it's probably sensible also to have a stockpile. So here is episode 10. And episode 10 I'm going to call Overview Books. Definitely Overview Books. We're going to start off with this one. Warships After Washington by John Jordan. Development of 5 major fleets, 1922 to 1930. I like this book. I realize I take the piss out of it quite often, excuse the French. I point out that I think that John has a far too polite understanding of the British position, in that he does seem to presume the British are more honest than the others are. I am more skeptical on this front, but he's a very experienced historian and it's a very good work. And it has, well, it's very readable. Let's see, can we find a nice section which I will, a nice quote from? I marked out 3 potential ones earlier. I think I'll go for the Italian Zara class. The impetus for the new design came from the naval staff, which, faced with the terminal obsolescence of its elderly dreadnought battleships, wanted ships that could fight as the backbone of the fleet. The only logical way to achieve this was to build a cruiser sufficiently well armored to take on its own kind in combat. Initial staff requirements were therefore for a ship armed with 8 203mm guns, with a speed of 32 knots, and with an armor belt 200mm thick, plus good deck protection. Still not quite sure how that's going to be enough, but, we can always hope, and at a decent range. The 4 cruisers of Zara class were in many respects the mini battleships the Regia Marina had long aspired to build, heavily armoured and well armed, with a good turn of speed. However, in order to obtain these quantities, the Italians consciously violated treaty limits on displacement. Even as designed, these ships displaced well in excess of 11,500 ton standard. The 3rd and 4th ships of the class, Zara and Gauzer, had multi-tiered bridge structures with director, the main battery of 203mm guns at its summit, and directors for secondary guns to port and starboard just below. One thing I will say I find slightly annoying with this book when I'm reading it is there isn't much of a differentiation between the text, which is caption, and the text, which is content in terms of size. I would have liked them to be slightly more obvious. Clearly, these requirements were impossible to achieve on 10,000 tons, but the Italian constructors set about the task in their customary innovatory way. Hull scantlings were made as light as was technically feasible. A split-level hull configuration with a raised forecastle replaced the flush deck hull of the earlier ships. An arm was used to provide longitudinal strength, so that the overall weight of the hull was 28% less than that of the Trentos. Lightweight machinery on only 2 shafts, derived from the propulsion plant of the new light cruisers of the condottieri type, was adopted, thereby saving around 900 tons. Now that it was envisaged that these ships would fight in the battle line, in fact, Italian thinking at the time suggested that they might well constitute the battle line, the theoretical utility of torpedo tubes declined, so these could be omitted. Finally, the proposed armor belt, 200mm, was pared down to 150mm, tapering to 100mm below the waterline with a 70mm deck armor. Even with these measures, the ships are designed came out at around 11,500 tons standard. Although this was comparable to the standard displacement of the IJN's treaty cruisers as completed, the Japanese were as yet unaware of the full extent of their breach of the treaty, whereas the Italians were aware of this from the outset. 4 cruisers of Zara class, authorized on the 1928-30 programs, were mini capital ships in every aspect. Even turrets, barbettes, and turret trunks were armoured on a comparable scale to the hull. Turrets had 150mm faces and 120mm sides. The barbettes and turret trunks had 130mm to 150mm of armour above the upper deck, and 120 to 140mm between the upper deck and the main deck. These figures put even the Japanese cruisers in the shade, and make level protection accorded to the ostensibly heavily armoured British Surreys appear grossly inadequate. Surreys were never built. Total weight of protection in the Zaras was 2,700 tons, 26.5% of their declared 10,160 metric tons displacement, but about 23% of the standard displacement as completed. This is a good book. It's a good overview. But by gum, there's some nutty people in our world at this time. So, right then. It only seems fair that I should take these books in the order they are intended. Volume 1, Warship Camouflage, by Malcolm Wright. Destroyers, frigates, escorts, minesweepers, coastal warfare craft, submarines, and auxiliaries. It's the pictures you buy this book for in many respects. If you're painting ships, if you're doing ship models, you want these books. You want them, and you want them bad. But if you are someone who just likes reading little snippets about all sorts of different classes of ships and all sorts of different ships, then this is perfect. Tartar is shown in a scheme that combines low visibility of the WA shades and a dark patch to give a shortening effect. It was found that a dark area tended to draw the eye away from the other sections in light colours. Colours seem to be overall white, with WA blue, PB10, and a small area of MS40. She is shown with a lattice mast fitted to carry the increasing amount of radar and other electronic equipment. She has 6 twin 20mm mounts, with those on the bridge wings power operated. That's her in 1944. This is Maori next to her. Maori was lost at the end of 1942 and has some modifications, but the scheme is an early Admiralty style that combines light and dark shades to give emphasis on her midships and lessen the view of other areas. The overall colour is 507C, with areas of WA blue and B5. Radar on the mast is Type 286P. The fully rotating version. Decks have been dulled with dark grey to make her less visible from the air. Punjabi was lost in 1942, but is shown here with some changes. X-gun has been replaced with a 4-inch twin AA. She has single 20mm on the aft deckhouse and in the bridge wings, but still has the old quad MGs behind the funnels. The scheme is an Admiralty light disruptive type, intended to confuse the length and range of the ship. Colours are 1941 blue and 1940 green on an MS4A overall. She has a fixed Type 286P radar at the masthead and a Type 285 radar, gunnery radar, on the director. Decks are natural Semtex. The bridge has wooden slats, as these made it easier on men's feet during long hours on watch. This is a really cool book. I mean, I can look through it and I can look up sloops and I can compare and contrast their designs, their colouring, how they change, and that's the really thing. It doesn't just give you one image of a ship, it gives you as many as it can. So it even gives you a story of Mountbatten Pink and HMS Thanet. But it shows you HMS Thanet as she existed in 1942 and as she goes on through the war. It also shows you where these ships end up in other nations' service. Some of the old S-class destroyers did end up in Japanese service they were captured. And it shows you them. It shows you their pictures. It shows you the pictures of HMS Wild Swan and Wolverine and Waterhen and Vampire and Voyager over and over again. It gives you multiple pictures of Vega and Vanity. It allows someone who's interested in this to compare and contrast the ships as they change their colours and their times. It's beautiful. Now, this is a gorgeous book. And even holding it, I feel trepidation opening it because it is so beautiful inside. I'm going to start waxing lyrical very shortly, because there is in it 2, 4, 6, 8 pictures of Warspite throughout her life, and the different colour schemes she goes through. Queen Elizabeth also has those. Lovely, lovely things. The aircraft carriers, the little escort carriers. It's just... it's a beautiful book, and it has, again, those little write-ups of them. This is volume 2 in the series. It's Battleships and Aircraft Carriers by Malcolm Wright, British and Commonwealth Warship Camouflage, World War II. And it is one of the most beautifully illustrated books I have the great pleasure of not just having seen in my life, but own. Hermes on the Far East with white and buff. White, grey and buff. And her air group and what they look like. And them positioned to scale, as well as to a size which allows you to understand their looks and their colour scheme, but also positioned to scale so you can see how they are fitted on the ships. And it is just so many of HMS Hermes. So many of HMS Furious. Furious looks like a mobile, I don't know, island at this point, and this just... it is gorgeous. But I have to say, overall, my favourite thing is the little, when they're looking at the aircraft carriers, those little aircraft, they're just drawn so well, and it gives you an idea of what their air groups look like. And if you can match it with other books, if you're like me and you have something like Squadrons of the Fleet Air Arm sitting here, you can start to match those colour schemes to the colour schemes illustrated there, work out which squadrons they're talking about. You can do all sorts of things. It's one of those books that allows you to bring together a lot of other information. This is why I call it an overview book. And it is beautiful. It also belies the idea that the Royal Navy wasn't bothering about air defence, because the moment you start looking through these ships, you start seeing the sheer number of machine guns, of pom-poms, of things appearing in their design, and you start to go, okay, right then. This was something that was being worried about. I will say, the one thing I do find upset, to an extent, is HMS Vanguard doesn't make it in there. I can understand why not, but I think it would be nice for her to be in there. But this is a gorgeous book. Absolutely gorgeous book. I'm going to be over 15 minutes on this one. Volume 3. Cruisers, mine layers, and armed merchant cruisers. Ooh. Again, the sections have just grown. In the destroyers, there's sort of little snippet bits. In the carriers and cruisers, they have a whole page themselves, so of course they have more, but for these, for the cruisers, it's their entire life story. HMS Kent here is being laid out in beautiful form. She's got 3, 5, 7, 8 different sets of illustrations. Goodness knows how many actual illustrations of her, considering 4 of those are double ones, so 12 illustrations probably of her, and all the different colour schemes and of her career, of how she looks in 1929, 1934, 1932, and how she changes in World War II. And one of the things you never realise so much is how many ships in 1940 are painted black and white. They look like my dog. They look like the fluffy research assistant. And that's to break them up. And it's also because black and white is our easy colours they've got to get hold of to start to break up outlines and to start to make visual identification more complicated. And this is just a gorgeous book. It is a really beautiful book. Let's see, can we find a really good black and white one to illustrate with? Oh, I think we have to go with HMS Enterprise. And if I just use the light properly, you can see how in the differing lights that affects the camouflage. And makes you sort of go, well, how long is that ship? What's her lines? What's her outline? What is she? Because of the way it goes. And that is the point, the camouflage. And the sort of the different banding, these things are not to make the ship invisible. They're to make the ship harder to identify and work out what it's doing. It's not camouflage to disappear, it's camouflage to mystify. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I'm sorry those 4 books has gone on a little bit longer. So, thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed the 4 random books. Episode 10.